Got your water?
I haven't actually. I should have done that, shouldn't I?
Yeah, go
Oh
get a
my
water
God.
real quick. So I'll just count us down and we will go. 3, 2, 1. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Jeff Frick here, coming to you from the home office, and we're really excited because we're kicking off season 2 of Work 20XX. It's a new year, it's a new season, and who better to have on than probably one of the preeminent workplace experts? She's been right in the middle of a lot of the revolution. She's had the good fortune of being in some progressive situations with some budget, and we're really excited to have her on to kick off this season. So joining us through the magic of the internet, all the way from San Francisco, she's Tracy Hawkins, the former VP of Real Estate and Work Transformation at Twitter. Tracy, great to see you today.
Great to see you too, Jeff. And thanks for saying former, because I am looking for my next gig.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, there's a number of people that have been impacted by the recent layoffs. So you're not alone, but I'm sure with your skill set, it will not be a long journey. So you maybe take advantage of a little bit of a break with the family before you jump back in with both feet. But let's go into it, because you were at Twitter for a long, long time. You've really been riding kind of this transformation of workplace. So let's step back a little bit, because you came out of it kind of from the real estate side. So kind of how did you get into the real estate side of it? And then what was the kind of transformation from real estate into this more kind of general purpose workplace?
At Twitter or just in general?
In general, and then we'll get to Twitter.
Mm-hmm. And one clarification, I actually left Twitter of my own volition. So whilst a lot of my colleagues were impacted, and it's been an interesting and a challenging time, it was a decision that was right for me. So the real estate side of things, I've had such an amazing journey at Twitter. I was actually based in London when I first got my role at Twitter, and I moved to Dublin in Ireland to look after everything for them internationally. And I was doing pretty much the whole gambit of real estate, leasing and transactions, the facilities management side of things, workplace operations, and also the design and construction side. So when I joined in 2013, it was a real hyper growth time, and we were building tons of spaces around the world. It was very much an office-centric culture, like a lot of our peers, a lot of other companies were. And through that time, we really, really grew. It was a fantastic time to learn a lot about the real estate side of things. When I joined the real estate and facilities team, we were in the finance team. And we actually moved over in 2020 to the people team. And even 18 months before that, we were working really closely with the people team, because we were decentralizing. We didn't want the base of power to be in SF. We wanted to be more of a global company. We wanted to be able to attract and retain talent all around the world. So that then prompted our transition into the people team, where we took on more people related work and also all the future of work type of remit as well. So it was a really exciting time for us. And that's how we took on more of the remote work and looking at hybrid work, even before the pandemic kind of prompted us into, or many other companies were kind of forced into the route. We were already going down that route. So it kind of prepped us really well.
So let's talk about kind of the 2018-ish time frame, when you're, heads down hyper growth. And I think you said one of your quotes is that, kind of the office is kind of the manifestation, the physical manifestation of the culture. And I just love how everybody, has a lens through which they see. And you came at it from the real estate, and you talked about it being very office centric. And in fact, early days of COVID, getting ready for this, you were even saying, I'm sure we're going to get back, because it's such an important part of the culture. So before we talk about kind of where we are today, I wonder if you could share how, you were able to kind of use the tools of real estate in the office to instill culture and to make it more than just, a sea of beige cubes, and to really, use those tools at your disposal to drive culture.
Yeah, so I think what's really important when we were looking at our spaces back then was to really work with the local site leads and the local teams there. And so although we infuse a feeling of the brand, consistency and the logo and all of that usual stuff, it was really important for us when we did a new space to not maybe have an international vendor who was the architect for all of our spaces or the project manager for all of our spaces, but to work very closely with local vendors vendors, local companies, so that we really understood that local flavor, but also work with site leads and folks who were just interested in space, understand where they hung out after work and where they took clients, and their interests and what was important to them in the space and how they used it as a business. So really for me, even before I got into projects or new offices, what I did when I very first joined Twitter was just sit down with all of the site leads, whether it was virtually or in person, to understand what was important to them, because that varied from culture to culture. And then that really informed us as we built out spaces or refreshed them or looked for new ones, that number one, it was a partnership approach, but it really helped us think about like how they saw Twitter in their country or in their city, and how they interacted with sales partners and clients. And then we built a space that reflected that. So for me, that was our approach. And then naturally, as people came in and used those spaces, they were really proud of them. It was a space that not only did they bring in like clients and partners, but also, folks that we would do philanthropy type efforts with, within the local community, or family members and friends. They would bring them in as well because they'd be really proud of the spaces. So that was really our approach. It took a lot longer to build, in that upfront stage. And we worked really closely with our sourcing and procurement partners as well. That's an important partnership there. But it really meant that we were able to build spaces that had that good balance of a local flavor, but also the feel of Twitter. And also when you work closely with folks who are actually in that office, you get less of that kind of cliched, oh, here's what I think a London office should look like with black taxi meeting rooms and red phone boxes everywhere. You get actually what they want to see, and not something that's, ball pits and slides in the office. It feels like a space they can be proud of.
Right. And so, I mean, I love and you've mentioned it in a bunch of talks, that people that can be proud of, so they can bring not only their work associates, but their family and friends, and, show the people. But I'm curious, were you starting to move into kind of activity-based spaces even at that time, right? I mean, there's a great study by Ryan Anderson, talking about where the office really excels, and the three things that they highlight in that study are, culture and collaboration, right? Or culture and social bonding, building with the team. 2 is heavy collab work. And then 3, I think the one that catches a lot of people by surprise is the library, the isolation, for people that don't have the space or opportunity. Were you kind of moving that way already, away from the ugly, open, loud office? Everybody's got headphones and can't concentrate anyway.
I think we were trying to give folks choice, trying to provide lots of different types of spaces. So we were leaning into more of like the residential feel as well. So you could have a team area where it was more open plan, but we also tried to balance that with a lot of different types of meeting rooms around it, whether it was rooms with soft seating or rooms that were more kind of your standard setup, smaller rooms for one person. So you could have a choice in your immediate area and you weren't trekking all over the building. We also did, I think, back in 2013, started to build more library type spaces. So those were really kind of quiet spaces, or teams could use them to get together in them as well, and kind of more drop-in spaces as well, coffee bar type of environments, cafe spaces, just different types. So we were already thinking, the choice and what do people want to use that space for that day. And really we came to that conclusion again by the upfront programming of the space, sitting down with the teams that use them and understanding like, how do you use space? What do you come into the office to do? And that helped us program the space and provide these different types of environment, because everyone's different, right? Even for a similar piece of work, they might want to try a different type of space. So it was really just about giving our employees choice.
Right. I mean, it's such a great piece. The Wall Street Journal did that piece on LinkedIn Building 1, and I think they said they had 75 different types of seating areas and different, kind of arrangements areas. And it's pretty interesting. Then I think it was Capital One was the first one to have that bank commercial that looked like a coffee shop. And the first time you saw it, you're like, what is that? It doesn't look like a bank, but again, kind of progressive thinking really to take it. But I'm curious, again, kind of pre-pandemic, what were you seeing in terms of the utilization and the sensors? Because, there's a lot of kind of this return to office, this nostalgia of what was, right? We
Yes.
tend to nostalgize things that are in the past, but a lot of the people are saying that, people are already worked from home, people are at conferences, they're traveling to clients. So what were you seeing, and were you getting any kind of premonition from the data in terms of utilization, or were you kind of staying ahead of it based on the activities that the people were asking for?
I mean, we were really looking and trying to study. We didn't have sensors at the time, but we had like badge data, and we were really trying to understand how many people were coming in. And like you say, folks were out at conferences, people were on, leave or, on vacation. And most days it would only be about 40% occupied. Now, that was our desks, and maybe some of those folks were in meeting rooms as well, meeting rooms. But we have salespeople who might be out the office or working from home. And we definitely did have folks kind of informally working from home. We didn't have so much of a policy around it, but we definitely did see that the office was somewhat underutilized, and it was quiet walking through the spaces. So I agree with you. I think there is some of this nostalgia of like how it was like super bustly and busy before the pandemic. And certainly there were days when it was, or you would have offsites and people coming to visit, and then a lot of people would be drawn in. But day to day, I think we kind of, really look back with rose tinted glasses, maybe a little bit.
Just a little bit. That's all right. But it's interesting to think back. So, but you guys were ahead of the curve. So again, kind of pre-COVID, but post, the way things were, you guys were already starting to think about enabling not as much remote for remote's sake, but it sounds like really opening up your TAM, your total available market of people that you could employ, and really starting to think beyond, do they live in San Francisco so they can work out of this office or other office? And I think at one point you said you counted up the bodies and there were more people remote than there were in any single location. So how did that come about? How are you getting a little bit progressive and thinking, how do we expand the TAM of our hiring population? And space is a big piece of that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, aside from attracting new talent, we would lose people just because we didn't have an office in a specific location. People have to move sometimes because of things happen in life, supporting a spouse, or, they need to go home to wherever their family's from. And we had really great people who had all this institutional knowledge about Twitter, really loved working at the company, didn't want to leave, but would have to because we kind of had a policy of, you had to live near an office and come into the office, and it just seemed really, really crazy. And then you layer on top of that all of these, potential talent out there who would be amazing employees for the company, but because they didn't live near an office, same thing. So we started really thinking about what can we do that will enable us to keep these folks or attract these folks? And obviously the logical part of that was just trying to open up the world a little bit more. Now, as we did that, initially we were like, work from anywhere, we'll employ anybody anywhere. And I mean, I think most people know once they've gone down that route, it's not as easy as it looks. There's tax implications, there's kind of security sometimes implications, and obviously it varies from company to company around risk tolerance and all of that. But we really started in an idealistic place. And then I think we came somewhere in the middle of, right, okay, we can open up some more, but we also need to make sure entities are set up and that type of thing, which is a lot of work, a lot of partnering with internal partners in finance and tax and legal and the people team. And so we definitely did open up a lot more. And I think we really laid the foundations around behaviors as well. We said, no, we don't necessarily need to be in the office every single day. And if you're back to back in meetings, what does it matter especially if they're global and you're working with partners or colleagues all around the world? And we started thinking about behaviors around more asynchronous work, because folks had always complained about having just so many meetings anyway. So it's like, what could we do to document more? What could we do to involve all the folks that we have working for Twitter? Not just because you're in San Francisco, you don't just have the best ideas because you're at the HQ. How do we involve folks from all the regions? And I think because, I'm not from California, you can hear, I'm from the UK originally. I had that experience of reporting into US companies and somewhat feeling a bit of a second-class citizen. And so I was able to think about the behaviors and how, now that I'm in the US, how can we change that, and how can we kind of lay the foundations for something that was a little bit more inclusive as well?
Right.
Also thinking about, neurodiversity, diversity and inclusion. Some folks don't want to participate as much on camera, or they're not just inclined to speak up as much. And so as we think about more asynchronous work and being more globally inclusive, that also, supports those folks too.
Tracy, you touched on about 20 of my bullet points here, so we have a lot to go through. So
Sorry.
I love it. So let's start with first off, I haven't really heard anyone talk about, embracing remote so that you can retain your best talent when they go through some life change that's forcing them to change geographies. I think that is super insightful. But let's talk about async and some best practices, because as I mentioned in the intro, you were fortunate to have some good support and some good resources. So I want to kind of share some best practices with people that maybe weren't so. And I think async is the most important piece of all. I started this journey with Darren Murphy years ago, and he just pounded that. And async is an effective communication vehicle. And because, as you said, people aren't at all these companies now are global and distributed, and no one is in the same office anyway. And even if you're in the same city, you're often not in the same office. And even if you're in the same office, you might not be in the same floor or even in the same cube at that moment in time. So let's talk about async, kind of how did, your adoption of async, and really more importantly, how did you help, kind of roll that out within the culture to increase the adoption of kind of effective async communication to make up for the fact that we're not all together all the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the most important things about asynchronous work is creating the time and space to be able to do it. So one of the things we rolled out at Twitter was something, and you have to forgive us because everything is bird related at Twitter, or was. And so we had perch time every day. And perch time was basically an hour cleared from the calendar. And that was really important because, if you're going to lean into asynchronous work, that means more docs. And you don't want to have a bunch of meetings and then also on top of that have the docs to work on. More folks were using Slack and using email, and it's easy to get, suddenly overwhelmed and even more work. So the hour of perch time was really for us to be able to go through any asynchronous docs we've been tagged into, and it gave us that time and space to really focus on that work. Also, some teams within the company I did no meetings Fridays with my teams too, which also allowed us to work on that type of thing and clear the decks before the weekend, go in not feeling stressed and be prepped and organized for the next week. So I think if you're going to adopt more asynchronous work, you also have to create the time and block it out, and have leaders modeling that behavior and using the async docs as well for it to be successful. Otherwise, it just becomes more overwhelming, additional work to do on top of meetings as well. We also would acknowledge that people were very busy. So when we went into a meeting which had a doc attached to it, we would give a few minutes at the start for folks just to skim over it again, just in case they haven't had the time. But it was something that we adopted as a company. We had it in manager trainings. We had, information about it in NHO. When we rolled it out, my team stood up in front of the company. We had what we called our big all hands one team meetings, and we walked through how asynchronous work was now a part of the fabric of the company. Everyone would be adopting it. It was great because it made us more global and more inclusive, and it freed them up meeting times, because sometimes you wouldn't even need to have a meeting to talk it through. You could achieve your objective just through having that async doc. Right. So it was something that was a commonly adopted behavior across the company, and something you would learn about from day one of being at Twitter.
Right. So you mixed it in, but I want to call it out specifically, and that's meetings, because I think they deserve their own category. And so you mentioned a couple things. So you and your team had no meetings Friday. Were there other kind of best meeting practices that you guys adopted either through formal training or formal kind of rules of engagement? Or, I was at Intel early in my career, and they had the meeting rules, on every wall. You've talked about, etiquette, and I can see that that's kind of, what are the rules of communication. So what were some of the specific things around meetings that you help people, have, as our friend Darren likes to say, make them harder to have?
Yeah. I mean, every meeting had to have an agenda to start with. So everybody knew why they were there. That was really important, so that you knew it was actually a meaty, worthwhile topic to meet for. We also had a great approach, which our CFO, Ned Siegel, put in place, which was the DASIN model. So when you were working on a topic or a project, you had a driver, approver, and you could only have one of each. Consulted folks, informed, and then next steps. So any meeting was super productive because you knew who owned it, you knew who was driving it, and then, you know, what your role was in that meeting. We did have etiquette on the screens in the office. So you know that if you're in the office and somebody was dialing in, then you dialed in through your laptop. You used the audio of the room, but you used the kind of visual video component of your laptop, and then you're all the same size on the screen, and it kind of feels, you know, level playing field, equality. And we had, you know, information on the tables as well to remind folks to do that. Just little prompts around the space. The big screens that we had in our hallways talked about how we'd adopted asynchronous work, and but also around meetings. And if, you know, there's 10 of you in the meeting and 7 are from your team, do all 7 need to be there as well? Or can one person or 2 people be there? So it was like giving permission that if you turned up to a meeting and there was a whole bunch of your team there, to actually reassess and say, hey, do we all need to be here? Or can some of us go away and work on something else?
Right.
And then having really good hygiene around your calendar, you know, very much looking at it on a regular basis and saying, do all these meetings still make sense? Should I be getting rid of some of these? Can they be replaced by asynchronous work? Definitely there are times when you're building relationships, sprinting on projects, or you have something that is just not coming across in either email, Slack, or an asynchronous dot where it's just easier to have a conversation. But there are definitely things now that have transitioned to work that you can do offline as well.
Right.
So I think it's just that unspoken agreement as well around just having the permission to reassess who's in the room and do we all still need to be here?
Well, I'm curious because, you know, a big theme that's happening now with, you know, the increase of hybrid work is that a lot of the current managing class were not trained to operate in a way where they can't see people or they can't look over their shoulder. And a lot of the traditional indicators of is work getting done and are people getting what I'm trying to get them to do, you know, you don't have those. So there's a, you know, this call for training to help people. So how did you, you know, kind of keep ongoing formal training with, you know, managers who are at the front lines of this thing to help them and make sure that they're continuing to invest in the tools and the time, and the best practices, because, you know, their bosses probably didn't live in, well, we know they didn't live in this world.
Right. I mean, this is where the partnership with the HR and people team is so crucial. Every few weeks, we would have a meeting with the managers called Managers Assemble. And that was a time when we would remind around the etiquettes and welcome feedback from them as well as to how is it going with your team? What are the problems you're seeing around hybrid work or folks working remotely? And that is how we had the evolution around, here's some of the things that we think are important to meet for in person, like we talked about just now around relationship building or sprints, or, you know, if you have an issue with something, getting together really quickly and not letting it fester. And then here's the things that we think work really well asynchronously. But I think the most important thing is not working in a vacuum on this stuff. Our managers knew when we presented and collaborated with them that this was a work in progress for us. You know, this was almost like an ongoing pilot. We'd been in a pandemic for 2 and a bit years, and it's going to take a year or 2 for us to work out and find our stride and what our new behaviors are and what works at Twitter was not necessarily going to work everywhere else, but it was definitely a collaboration with the managers. And then also, you know, through pulse surveys and through us just talking to leadership at Twitter, we were able to give feedback to them around, you know, the modeling of the behavior that we needed to see from them, the feedback that we were hearing from the managers. And so it really was, the communication side is just so important, and the relationship between the real estate or whoever's driving future of work or hybrid work and the people team and the rest of the company and leadership is just so important. You can't do this work in a vacuum and assume that people will just join the dots for themselves. You really have to help them with that.
Right, right. But I'm curious, as you change from the real estate team and kind of under the CFO and measuring efficiency and kind of those traditional metrics versus being part of the HR team and looking at retention and productivity, also efficiency, a different kind of efficiency. How did the metrics change that you guys were using to measure success? How did you help managers, kind of focus on the right things and avoid, some of the common problems we know with presenteeism and having a silly camera monitor system that knows how long you've been in Zoom all day. I mean, all these silly things.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, I think when we moved, I like to say we kept a foot in the finance team and a foot in the people team, because that fiscal responsibility, the level of trust, the foundation of that trust with the finance team is so important, right? The real estate team spend a lot of money, even if we're looking at less space now and all that, we still spend a lot of money. And so to have that trust is so important. And the folks within our finance team were super creative and we valued their input. So we made sure we really nurtured that relationship. Moving to the people team, we were able to have the benefit then of like everything was evolving. So we were getting density sensors. We were evolving our business intelligence tool, which allowed us to input how many people were remote and integrate HR systems and have a feed into that of accepted, not started, and how many people are leaving. And then also we were able to grow our relationship with the people insights team, because I was part of that leadership team and worked with that person too. So they then helped us analyze things like pulse data, exit interview data. And so I feel like we were able to build on the data and the metrics that we had just by being a part of that team. But it was something that was very timely, and maybe we wouldn't have had access to that as part of the finance team because it just, it wasn't existing at the time. We were kind of growing our approach too, and in having sensors come along and growing our Robin system. So, we used Robin for the conference rooms before the pandemic, but then we also partnered with them to add on the desks, so that as we went from a team kind of area model to people being able to work wherever they wanted to based on the activity they did that day, we were then able to pull the metrics on the type of space they were booking. So we zoned our offices from collaborative, social, and focus areas. And so then we could see the utilization of those areas. So it was more of an evolution. And then we partnered with the people team to really look at like, how do we analyze this? And we can work with talent acquisition and we can work with learning and development to see how we then evolved our approach. So it was more of a growth over time rather than, oh, here's some new insights just because we're in the people team. And then we also kept a very close relationship with the CFO. So we would speak to him every few months and report on how we were using our space and all the new metrics. And we would do a QBR for our chief people officer. So I really do think that credibility piece is important. The facts and figures piece is important, along with the hearts and minds piece, which people think traditionally for HR is around like the hearts and minds and people experience. But ours was super, super data driven with our people insights team and pulse data and all sorts of things. And there was a lot of cross pollination between the two orgs.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you, with the rise of the systems like Slack, and I think you said you've used Google Workplace at Twitter, that you do have so much more data sets, and you just went through, kind of a laundry list of different data inputs. And you said it really wasn't necessarily evolutionary, but just more and continuous. I mean, did it change over time? Were there any big surprises? Were there any kind of conventional wisdom that just got turned upside down once you started digging into some of this data? I'm just curious.
I mean, one of the big surprises to me was, when we went to work from home completely during the pandemic, I think the first few months, everyone was like, remote work's amazing. I can focus and take my dog to the vet and like get my package and have my house redone and like do all my work. And people were loving work from home. And then we got like 6 months in and everyone was climbing the walls because work from home and remote work was getting a bad rep, because remote workers now, they go to coffee shops, they work in a co-working space. They don't just are imprisoned in their houses. And so it wasn't the best experience of remote work for everyone. And then folks were craving that in-person time and seeing their colleagues, and was really missing it and having so many more meetings and all of that. But I think one of the things that I really learned from our data insights and from our, pulse information was people use space for different things. So I used to think that everyone's at home because they love focusing, and everyone comes into the office because they love socializing and seeing other people. But actually, we had like a decent amount of our folks who really appreciated that separation of like, my home is for my personal life and my office is for like work and where I get things done. And maybe they feel more inspired there because they're immersed in the brand and they're seeing other people. And so we saw, quite a lot of folks who would come in to do focused work, rather than, not just because there was distractions at home. There might not have been any distractions at home. They just wanted to be in the office. And so the office meant different things to different folks, and not just that kind of social running into other people. But some people really like it because the tools are there. Their AV works really well. We took on AV during the pandemic as well, because it was all part of the people experience. And we launched Zoom and did a bunch of other things, enhancements like that. And so folks really liked coming in the office because they knew what the setup was going to be like. They knew the Wi-Fi was going to be stable. And so they were guaranteed a really good experience. They also love to come in and, host people as well for that really great experience. So one of the insights for me, that was really interesting to me, because I was just expecting everybody to be like, oh, I work from home because the focus piece is just so much better than being in the office. After, all the feedback over the years of, I hate the open plan and I hate waiting for a meeting room and having to book things. I think there is some element of people now appreciate those things so much more, but they appreciate it when it's part of choice and they're not forced.
Right. So I'm curious, we started this out and you come from your real estate background, and you talked about, the office and real estate as kind of the physical manifestation of culture. Well, now suddenly you don't have that necessarily for everyone. How did you transition, to think about, kind of infusing culture without you still have the office for the people that are in, but using other tools to still accomplish that very, very important goal?
Yeah, it's like you say, like the office is one tool. It's one piece of the pie for the culture. So it's still available to folks, and they still get that great experience when they come in. And quite often I see folks when they were coming in, they'd be like, wow, I forgot how great it was to come in. And it's a great reminder. But I think the culture is more about the people, the etiquettes, how folks feel involved. As we started thinking about creating a more level playing field, we were thinking, the whole gambit. So the career experience, the access to great work, and feeling equally a part of the culture. And that's very much around that level playing field aspect. So when we were in the pandemic, we moved from doing what we called our big one team all hands meetings. They used to be, dial in. If you're not in SF, you see the sea of bodies in SF and a dot on the stage presenting. And then during the pandemic, we went to everybody just dialed in, and then you could ask questions and collaborate over Slack. And everyone was the same size on the screen. And it was, fun. You got to see all these people dialing in all from all around the world. We did it at different times of the day. So it was friendly to APAC one time, friendly to the US and EMEA another time. And I think that's more about building culture. We thought about how we supported our employees during the pandemic, and we did what we called Camp Twitter, which was we worked with OutSchool online. There was 30,000 different classes, live on-demand classes that parents desperately needed during that time when they were trying to work and entertain kids and educate the kids. We helped folks with their at-home setup. We helped them connect online, but also in person in their local cities, and not in the office, in some kind of what we call tweep ups where they met and just socialized. And I think those are the things that build culture. If you're supported and your company cares about you and you have choice and you feel like as much a part of the team when you dial into a meeting because everybody's the same size. And then one day you decide to go into the office and you get your selfie or whatever you want with the bird in the comments. Like, those are all different pieces of the big pie that makes up culture. It's not just one thing. And I think not feeling part of a culture is when you feel excluded, right? When you don't feel like, your voice is heard or your voice is counted, which is where asynchronous work comes in, because it's very inclusive. And so I think as we looked at our new practices and evolved through the pandemic and beyond, we were always putting that lens on it of like, how would this feel as hybrid work? How would this feel as a remote work? And that's what builds the culture, not like bricks and mortar and a sign, you know.
Right. It's interesting. I just listened to a podcast the other day with Anu George, and she talked about, one of the things she valued most for her experience is having worked in lots of different countries and had international experience. Like you said, your accent tips that you probably didn't grow up down the street from Twitter headquarters in San Francisco. Right. With your international experience, how do you think that's really helped you be more successful?
I didn't realize how important it was actually until I moved here. I moved to San Francisco in 2014 for a more senior position, and yet my days felt easier and shorter because I could have those casual interactions with leadership that if you were outside of SF might take weeks to get on the books, but I could just run into them or have the elevator conversation with them. And those folks were within the time zone where I was as well. So I didn't have the extended long days that when I worked in Dublin and London, I could, and I was lucky then because I didn't have a daughter at that point. So I wasn't doing school run and I wasn't, trying to fit in and be present for her, which I don't know how folks internationally, when they have to deal with really long days on a regular basis, that's really tough. But I would go into Twitter Dublin at, 7 a.m. because I was looking after folks in Singapore, but then also folks in London, all around the outside of the US. And I could be there, next time I look at my watch, it's like 8 p.m. at night. And I'm like, wow, that's the entire day gone, So when I moved to the States, I was already thinking, what are the things that annoy the hell out of me around the US habits when I'm in international, and how can I help make that an easier and nicer experience? And it's the little things like I'd be sat there at 6 o'clock at night and someone would come into a meeting with me 10 minutes late with their breakfast cereal, or someone would send me an email and it would send from the US and it would say, I need this by close of business today. And it was like 5 p.m. already. And I was like, well, it's my close of business already. And you already asked for this. And so I don't think there was no malice in it. Twitter was a great place to work. I just think there was just maybe in the early days of just a lack of just understanding how it works internationally. Everyone's just trying to get work done, work really quickly. So one of the things I think I brought when I got to the States was just being more inclusive and being more considerate of folks who are around the world, rotating the time that we did things and allowing them, enabling and empowering them to say, do I need to be in this meeting? Is there something we can put in a doc and share with them? A lot of the times they'd want to be there, obviously, because they want to have FaceTime, they want to be part of it and be in the brainstorming as well. But definitely when I moved to the US, I was always thinking about my experience outside the US and trying to have those folks speak up, trying to have them give ideas, because just because you're in the right time zone doesn't mean to say that you have all the best ideas. The right time zone being, the one where the meeting is happening. So yeah, I was always thinking about that. And I still do think about it. I think it's really important. We've always been a global company since I joined. We just didn't have the right behaviors and etiquettes in place initially.
Right. So were you able to get some of those things codified at a much broader scale?
Yeah, I think when I first moved over, there was a lot of folks moving over from different regions as well. So I think it just became a common practice that we rotated meetings and we documented it a lot more. And so that set us up, for when we really thought about decentralization and diversifying more. But definitely as we saw more international folks move to SF and New York, we saw more of these behaviors that were more inclusive with our global colleagues.
Right. So one of the things that I've been asked about, remote work versus in person, and you just mentioned that things were a lot easier for a lot of reasons when you came over, the time zone and this and that, but you also mentioned, kind of the serendipitous exchange and interaction. How have you seen that get replaced in terms of the effectiveness and what it delivers when people aren't together? Things like the classic, run into each other in the halls and magic happens.
Yeah, I still think that's an area where there's a challenge. We did not have Slack initially. So I think Slack's been helpful because we've been able to see, who's online, and I'm quite willing to drop someone senior a note. But then, I was a VP at the company, so I had no issues about just hitting someone up and saying, let's have a coffee, let's have a chat. I think that is more challenging for more junior folks. And that for me is why the balance is important. That's why having guidelines around when meeting in person is more effective, and how often you should meet in person, and making sure that leaders are a part of that, so that folks who aren't in offices or who aren't, here in where the leaders are based, get to have that FaceTime as well. So it's very intentional. I also think that creating teams that are intact around the world. So for example, having a team in London with a leader there who's empowered to make decisions, that's something that companies need to think about more, having more leaders dispersed around the world. But I think what's happening right now is folks are just thinking about how can we be more intentional around bringing people together? How can we have overlap of different organizations so we get to cross-pollinate and share ideas and, work on those KPIs and OKRs at the start of the year so that we share them and can execute them together, and give people real solid time with leaders that, they're not getting as much of if they're working remotely.
Right.
In the location.
So a couple things there I want to follow in. They're kind of diametrically opposed, but they're kind of the same. And one is kind of onboarding and the other one is kind of mentoring, because you've talked about leaders and leaders getting together. How did you see... I'm going to say present company excluded, because things are probably different there than they were when you were there. But in terms of leaders modeling the behavior in which you were trying to encourage, and then again, kind of the specific onboarding challenges with remote and trying to drive this, intense culture. And then finally, this increased importance of communication with these distributed teams. How did that kind of play out? Kind of with the maturity of the process as we worked through, actually you guys are pre-2020, but 2020, 2021, 2022.
Yeah. So our NHO remained virtual. So there was that level playing aspect, and we were very, we were very clear around the asynchronous work and, how we were planning to gather together and the behaviors right from day one at NHO. So I think that piece, is really important, setting it up from the start. Our leadership also would come into NHO. I know Jack would present at NHO, and he was very passionate around, choice and giving folks access to the office or being able to work remotely or in a hybrid fashion. As we rolled out more behaviors and etiquettes, the first thing I would do is we would meet with our C-suite and walk them through what we were planning to do. But we'd also work with their teams and the folks, a layer below them in their teams to understand how anything we were thinking about would translate into their day-to-day work. Hear the pushback, pivot a little bit if we needed to. So for example, an example of us pivoting was initially we were going completely free address in our offices for the desks. You could sit anywhere, do anything. And folks were a little bit worried about when they came in, if they chose to come in, not running into people from their teams. And so for our bigger offices, we went to, you can sit anywhere you want, but that's an engineering floor. If you want to go sit with Eng, you can do. But we were really, as we were going through the process, taking the feedback, pivoting, trying to hear best practices from other companies, because everyone was trying to work it out. So our leadership were very, very receptive, and we worked with them on async docs as well. As we were rolling out new processes, it would be in an async doc, and they would go through it and put their comments in it. And if we came to something where there was an impasse or a question that was hard to answer, then we would meet with them in person. But we were already doing that behavior with them. They were doing that with their teams as well. And so it was something that was just like this big experiment at Twitter, and we were all working through it together. And you can imagine just so much happens on a platform like Twitter. It moves so fast that adopting the asynchronous work just helped us be more efficient as well. So we could really save those in-person or, video calls for things where we really needed to get to decisions.
Right. So this has been fantastic, Tracy, and I could keep you all day, but I won't. But as we get towards the end, I'm just, there's a lot of workplace professionals. You were in a really fortunate position for a while that, you had some resources and some really supportive management. I mean, where do you see kind of the best ROI, not in a pure ROI, but just, where people kind of get the best return of investment of their time and energy? And then, maybe what are some of the kind of the secrets to success that are maybe not that complicated, but maybe just a little bit below the surface that people can focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely did have resources. Twitter was a lot leaner than the peers that we're put in the same category and conversations with. So we were always really conscious of being careful with the dollars. But I do think there are things that folks can do where they don't need to buy technology. They don't need to bring in new systems and completely rip up their space. We didn't rip up our space and, convert it all to coffee shops. Like the first thing that we did was, change an existing system to be able to just zone spaces and to be, build on something that we had in place already. One, so we didn't have to invest in a brand new tool. Two, so it was something our employees were used to using as well. They were already very familiar with it. So I think that that's something that's important as you go through layering on new tools or new etiquettes, being able to build on something that you have in place already. Folks are much, much more comfortable with that. Things that we did that were actually didn't cost anything, but people really appreciated was that blocking out of time, agreeing as a company, we would do that perch time for an hour every single day. And if you saw that on someone's calendar, we tried to do it at the same time in the different, countries or time zones. You didn't book over it. That time was sacred and it allowed them to do the async docs. The no meetings Fridays, again, didn't cost any money to implement that, but freed up so much time and, stress for folks, allowed them to go into their weekends unburdened or, with their checklist done. And so those are things that you can adopt. And folks do really appreciate it and see the benefit from it. Simple things, I would say, even from the start of being in real estate, before all of this, going into decentralization, going into the pandemic, having that foundation of really good relationships with your stakeholders and your partners, that's what's going to set you up for success. Understanding how they work, what their goals are, not going into meetings talking about square footage and leases. That's like boring as hell for your end users who don't really care about it, but going in there to listen intentionally, to understand their world, and then being able to join the dots for them around how your work supports theirs. I mean, that's something that's important for teams too. I have worked with so many real estate teams that I've gone in and initially they just don't know how their work ladders up to the importance of the company. And it's actually foundational, that experience, the pride of working for a company. We're quite often the cultural ambassadors. This period that we're in is such an amazing time for us to be able to grow our scope, grow the skill set of workplace professionals, future-proof them. So now it's not just about the four walls of the office, but it's also about just the whole employee experience and the partnership with HR and finance. And it just opens up so much for us. I just feel like there's been a group of us who have been kind of really reticent and scared of the change when we actually should be super excited about this is growing our future and our scope and the amount of influence that we can have in a company. Like we now have a seat at the table for how people work moving forward. And so I would say be excited about it, really understand your end user, and always have that growth mindset. That's going to be the thing that stands us in good stead for the next few years.
I love it. And you and everyone who I talked to that's in this space is really excited about the future. It's, kind of the untethering of the four walls. It's the untethering of the network infrastructure that used to kind of define so much. It's the untethering of this geographic restriction that holds you back on whether you can keep people or get new people. So, Adrienne Rose, she's another workplace professional. She's like so excited, and it's a great final message. Embrace the opportunities that this affords. Don't whine and cry and complain of the world that probably didn't exist the way you remember it anyway.
Exactly.
All right. Well, Tracy, thank you very much for your time. I'm sure the phone will be ringing off the hook. Because this is a very, very important thing. And like you said, it's really all about employee experience. It's about employee retention, employee engagement. And the war for talent is not going to get any easier anytime soon.
Exactly. Thank you, Jeff. I've really enjoyed chatting with you.
Thank you. And thank you for everybody for listening for another episode of Work 20XX, watching on YouTube and listening on the podcast. We'll see you next time. Take care. We are clear. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.